In the previous lesson, we saw how we can use querySelector to make a selection of an element and then make use of that element within our JavaScript. This lesson, we're going to look deeper into querySelector as well as querySelector all. When we were making our selection, we were selecting via the button tag. And if we had two buttons, so if we had tip number 1 and tip number 2. So the buttons both are button tags, and there's no other way to identify them than the order that they're being represented on the page. So we've got tip number 1, which we're using our JavaScript and transforming it to hello. And then tip number 2, we don't actually see that we transformed it. And that's because we're using querySelector. And what querySelector does is it selects the first element of the page that matches that specified selector group or group of selections. So if none is found, then you're going to get null returned. So essentially, this is the syntax that we're using, and there's also some additional examples at the Mozilla Developer Network about how you can make that selection. And as you can see, that this is a selection within that same format where we're using ID. We can use classes as well as the tag names in order to make the selection. And all it does is return back the matching tag that is the first element that it finds within the page. Here's an example of how it's using class. And then here we're using querySelector with a more complex selector. And this is similar to what you're going to find within CSS in order to make the selection process. If we want to select more than one element on the page, then we can use querySelector all. So this returns back a node list representing all of the document elements that match that selection. So if, for instance, we had more than one element that we were selecting, we'll go back here and we're going to transform this and update this to querySelector all, go and refresh our page. We see that what's being returned over here is a node list. We've got a number of different elements on the page, and even if we only had one, we would still be returning back within a node list, except we'd have a list length of 1. And we can see that inner HTML is set to hello, but we're not specific on which element we're actually trying to select. And as button has more than one item within the node list, it simply puts the inner HTML to hello within the object of the node list, and we don't actually affect the actual elements that are on page. If we want to be more specific, we have to specify which element we want to select. We can do it within the same array type format where we select the node list starting at 0 index. And if we want to select the second one, it would be bracket 1. So this would be selecting the second element. Correspondingly, if we want to update that inner HTML, we could select it within this type of format. We also have the option, because it's within an array type format, that we can loop through the elements and update them. And we'll show you more on that in the upcoming lessons. But for now, we only have the one button, and we are going to be using querySelector. So go ahead and try this out for yourself and create a simple exercise where you've got more than one element that you're selecting, and you still want to select the first one. So try out using querySelector all. And of course, if you only have the one element, then you would be using querySelector, not querySelector all. But go ahead and try this out. In the next lesson, we're going to continue to build out our project.